Great. Okay, well, we're a minute after 3 o'clock. We've got some attendees with us and we've got 3 excellent panelists. So I think now's a good time to start. So welcome to today's webinar. I'm really pleased that we have from GSMA and also from UN Refugee Agency. We've got Jenny and we've got Matthew and we've got John, all of whom are here to tell us a little bit more in more detail really about what's going on in the digital lives of refugees from the recent research report which both organisations did. So thank you very much to our 3 amazing panellists for joining us today. There will be the opportunity to ask them questions and pose questions to them. We just ask if you could do that through the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of the screen, rather than the chat function, because it just makes it a bit easier for me to look through all the questions. And also, if we don't get around to some, we can download the questions from the Q&A and then get back to you all with the answers. So thank you very much. And I'm going to hand over to Jenny, who's going to kick us off for today. Over to you, Jenny.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And hello, everyone. We're really delighted today to have this opportunity to present highlights of our recent research that we've conducted alongside UNHCR, focusing on the digital lives of refugees. So we launched this report actually only last week in Kigali at our GSMA Mobile 360 series event. And we also had a launch in Uganda in Kampala yesterday. And we have a third launch in Bidi Bidi in northern Uganda, back to one of the locations where this research was conducted, and that will take place on Thursday. So in terms of the structure of the webinar today, I'm going to start by giving a brief introduction of the GSMA and our Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation program to those of you who are a little bit less familiar. And then I'm going to hand over to John Warnes of UNHCR so he can talk you through his work focusing on connectivity for refugees. Then I'm going to share some of the key findings from the research and move through some of the highlights from our 5 thematic areas that we focused on. I'm going to take you through gender and inclusivity and also the topic of mobile money. And then I'm going to hand over to Matthew Downer, my colleague at the GSMA, who will talk you through some more thematic areas focusing on mobile-enabled utilities, as well as digital identity. And then he will take you through the recommendations that are included in the report. And then we're going to close out with John outlining some of the next steps of this research, what we're now doing to take this forward. And then there'll be some time for Q&A at the end. So I won't dwell on this for too long, but just for those of you who may not be so familiar with the GSMA and our work, GSMA is the trade association for mobile network operators. We represent the interests of around 750 mobile network operators around the world. We have a foundation within GSMA called Mobile for Development, where we work to leverage mobile technology to improve the lives of underserved populations in low and middle income countries. We have around 10 programs now in Mobile for Development, one of which is called Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation, which is the program that Matthew and I work on. And our overall mission is to accelerate the delivery and impact of humanitarian assistance with the objective of trying to build out a digital ecosystem in humanitarian contexts. Our program is funded by DFID, and we were launched in February of last year. Why do we exist? Well, we've seen the latest figures from UNHCR are sadly that global displacement has now topped 17 million. And the rate of this overall growth in displacement continues to sadly exceed the rate at which solutions are being found. We know that mobile technology is definitely not a solution to displacement, but we have seen many examples of how it can improve the lives of people who have been forcibly displaced by helping them to receive the delivery of dignified aid, or by helping them to become more self-sufficient in the new places that they're now living. We've seen many examples of how mobile connectivity can improve access to financial services, utility services like energy, for example, identity services, as well as improving things like information to food security. Some of the figures also show that over 90% of refugees actually live in areas with 2 or 3G coverage, and this is expanding every day. So this means that there's a huge opportunity to harness mobile connectivity to improve preparedness, response and recovery for these populations. And through our work, we've seen that mobile network operators are stepping up to this challenge and finding sometimes that there's actually a business case for them to serve these populations. However, we've seen that the shared value partnership models between the mobile sector and the humanitarian industries are really still quite nascent, and sustainable models are also nascent. So these types of models are still in their infancy, which is why we have this Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation program to try and accelerate this. And we act as the bridge between our mobile network operator members and our humanitarian partners to try and catalyze these partnerships to really help these two very different sectors speak the same language so they can effectively digitize humanitarian assistance. This slide here shows we focus on these 5 key thematic areas, and today we'll be going through many of the ones that we focused on for this research. So with that, I'm going to hand over to John from UNHCR just to the work that UNHCR do. They are one of our key humanitarian partners that we work very closely with in this space, and he will give you a bit more of an outline of that work.
Thank you very much, Jenny. I'm happy to be here in this webinar today. I think it's a really important topic and something that's very close to sort of UNHCR's protection sort of focus is around how to ensure that refugees have the ability to access the benefits of mobile technology and to overcome every barrier to ensure that this is available for all. UNHCR has been sort of acknowledged a couple of years ago that previously where we'd provided services for humanitarian responders and the partners that we work with, that there was increasingly this desire amongst the populations we serve to have access to mobile technology, to access information, to communicate with their friends and loved ones, either in their country of origin or in their hosting country, as well as access a number of services both provided by the humanitarian sector or those simply that were available on the commercial market. As such, UNHCR decided to create the Connectivity for Refugees initiative to address some of these. This wasn't something that was designed for UNHCR to deliver alone in terms of providing services, but really to build a network of actors to help support this, from technology companies, mobile network operators who are vital in establishing cellular services in the countries where refugees are hosted, as well as other humanitarian aid and development organizations, governments, telecommunications regulators, and other private sector actors to help build an ecosystem which ensures that digital inclusion is available for all and that refugees are no less advantaged because of their status. Next slide, please, Jenny. Where we'd originally sort of framed this around some of those aspects that I was just mentioning, the real vision, though, comes back a step, which is really looking at the rights-based sort of approach to this. And we really do believe that displaced population communities that host them do have the right and the choice to be included in a connected society, regardless of their age, gender, or demographic, and that humanitarians and governments and private sector can work together to build out an ecosystem in which nobody's left behind, and that they can better the world for themselves, their families, and have access to those livelihoods that will take them forward more sustainably. The GSMA are a really important partner in this. One of the things we first recognized at the outset of embarking on this initiative was the real need for better data around what connectivity means. UNHCR had worked with Accenture to provide a great amount of data as part of an inception report for this initiative, but we needed to take that a step further. We'd been hearing in many different contexts anecdotal information around what connectivity needs were there for refugee populations. But through this partnership with the GSMA and the support that they received from Department for International Development, this really comprehensive digital lives of refugees research was able to be undertaken, which helps provide the insights that Jenny was mentioning and many more that we've not even uncovered yet from the rich data that we have. Next slide. So when we started going through this conversation together around the need for this data, we obviously wanted to address some of the research gaps where we had this anecdotal evidence but didn't really have something that we could bolster advocacy in to help change the way this enabling environment was, whether that was due to it being issues around policy making that needed to change, whether that was action that could take place within mobile network operators or the telecommunications industry more generally, or whether actually the onus was on humanitarian actors to modify the way that it was doing business, to perhaps use its finance and investment in different sort of ways to create a more inclusive digital sort of environment for refugees to access. So these three research gaps were essentially what some of the sort of prime areas that we wanted to look at, to actually not only get a sort of a quantitative component you can see there to look at this disparity in terms of access, but actually to have a really rich qualitative research. And Jenny and Matthew will go into this later, that it wasn't just a matter of numbers and surveys, but we have some really rich qualitative data that is helping inform the findings of this report and will inform our strategies and so on moving forward. Obviously, this work covers three different concepts, which I'll get into in a second, but the different types of barriers that exist are very different, whether we're looking at sub-Saharan Africa or in the Middle East. The dynamics around mobile access are very different. Each country has its own set of policies and regulations and different approaches to telecoms in terms of how it furthers the industry and the sector. So these were obviously very unique, and thus we wanted to get a broad sort of approach rather than just take one context. We wanted to do three. Next slide. So as such, the GSMA with UNHCR in partnership looked at these three different locations. The first being in Uganda, Bidi Bidi. So this is a more recent settlement that's been established following an influx of South Sudanese refugees following civil conflict there in 2015, and starting really fully in 2016. In July, we now have over 1 million refugees in Uganda, and the government has had a very welcoming policy towards refugees. They have more enhanced rights than many refugees do in other locations, yet obviously the areas that they were settled predominantly in northwest Uganda were very rural, lacking in infrastructure, lacking in investment. But obviously with such large numbers, there's obviously perhaps an impetus for mobile operators to provide cellular services out to these communities. UNHCR, with a number of partners, including operators like MTN and Airtel, as well as the GSMA, have been making efforts in these areas to enhance the way the digital access is formed, but we really wanted to get some better data and thought that this was a good context to look at. Secondly, Jordan. Obviously quite different. We wanted to have this disparate, this different type of context. So rather than a settlement, this was looking at an urban population of Syrian refugees who came with a much more connected sort of background and lifestyle. There's been a much stronger sort of investment in digital humanitarian services in Jordan comparatively with Uganda and Rwanda. So we were expecting to have different sort of statistics, which you'll see do manifest. But obviously there are nonetheless still certain barriers for certain community groups in terms of the way that mobile is used, and obviously a lot of rich stories about the benefits for these communities as well. Finally, Rwanda. This is one of the oldest camps in Rwanda. This is a Congolese population. We're looking at sort of the early 90s who've been there for an extended period of time, approximately 17,000 in Kiziba camp in the west of the country, in a very mountainous area, quite an isolated community, but nonetheless ones who are still actively engaging with mobile technology. There's been certain investments from humanitarians over the years, including a tertiary education campus with Kepler. So there was obviously a very interesting dynamic there. This population, in contrast with Uganda, rather than being a settlement, was a camp. So there are more restrictions around what the community there can do, where they can go, and rights around work and so forth. So that's just a snapshot of the three different rather diverse contexts. But ultimately, you'll see from the results how these differences in context do sort of come forward to bring some really interesting insights. I'll think this moment I'll hand over back to Jenny, unless there's another slide.
Great, thank you, John. So as John alluded to, in terms of the methodology, I won't go into too much detail, but we used a mixed methodology approach with both qualitative and quantitative components. We conducted surveys with nearly 3,000 people, and that covered both refugees and host community members, so around just under 1,000 surveys in each of the three contexts. For the survey, we used a stratified quota sampling method, which was used to try and ensure that the sample was as representative as possible of each of these very unique locations. And we stratified this by age, gender, and location. As you can see on the slide, we also conducted focus group discussions with both refugees and host communities, and this totaled around just under 50 focus group discussions across all contexts. So I wanted to go over the key findings. At the beginning of this report, we present the overarching findings that span across these 5 thematic areas that I mentioned earlier. And we really sought to try and explore further some things that seem fairly basic, but actually we had very limited data on, looking at mobile phone penetration, usage, and also the barriers to mobile ownership, access, and use. So this slide here looks at mobile penetration. And it was important that we had a very good understanding of this, because when we conducted some of the key informant interviews at the outset of this research and asked various stakeholders what percentage of refugees had mobile phones in these locations, the responses were wildly different, particularly in Bidi Bidi and Kaziba. So it's great now that we have this robust data to give us these stats to actually understand what the penetration is. As you can see, the majority of refugees own or access a handset. Nearly 2/3 of refugees in Kaziba own a phone at 62%, and nearly half do in Bidi Bidi at 49%. In Jordan, the column on the right-hand side, we'd heard that all Syrian refugees own a smartphone, but we actually found that this figure is more around 73%. So it's really useful to bear this in mind when we're considering, or humanitarian organizations are considering digitizing their services, especially when rolling out things like apps, when potentially actually not all the Syrian population actually has access to these mobile services. And then we also found that although phone penetration is higher in Kaziba, more people in that context had never used a phone. So that grey segment of the bar on the left-hand side represents the people who had never used a phone at 16%, and in Bidi Bidi that was 10% of people who had never used a phone. The light blue segment represents people who didn't own a phone, but they borrowed a phone. And this is quite a large segment of the population in Bidi Bidi. So although they're not completely digitally excluded, they definitely don't have full-time access. And another thing to bear in mind when digitizing services and humanitarian assistance. We also looked at the ways in which people were using mobile. This slide may not surprise you. Some of the most common mobile channels are the most basic, so using things like calls and SMS. But I think this really highlights that it's important not to underestimate the transformational potential of some of these basic use cases. And it's not always appropriate or necessary to actually roll out more advanced mobile services where the majority of people are actually using things like calls and SMS. The third column from the left shows the percentage of people using mobile money. This was very high in Bidi Bidi and Kaziba. For example, in Bidi Bidi, use of remittances were quite high, sending and receiving money between Uganda and South Sudan. And I have some slides later on to speak more in detail about the ways in which people are using mobile money and the barriers that they faced. One other thing to highlight on this slide is that we found that entertainment was actually a really common use case. And again, something that shouldn't be overlooked. We found in the survey and heard through focus group discussions the importance of using mobile phones for playing games, listening to music and watching films. So this highlights some of the overarching mobile use cases, but it goes into far more detail in the report itself. Another thing we focused on was the mobile internet. We found, as this slide shows, that less than 1 in 5 refugees in Bidi-Bidi are active internet users. And in Bidi-Bidi, 3 in 10 people had actually never heard of the internet, of the mobile internet. And in Kaziba, that was 1 in 10. And this is quite important to note because it really emphasizes the necessity of things like digital literacy. We asked the question in the survey, have you ever heard of the internet? If people said no, we made sure that they understood what the internet was, explaining frequent use cases of internet like Facebook, because some people recognize the internet via Facebook, and if people still said they hadn't heard of it, then they were included in these figures. Another thing we focused on that was really important for us to have a more nuanced understanding of was barriers to phone ownership and mobile internet. So this slide on the top row, it represents barriers to ownership, mobile phone ownership, and the bottom row represents the barriers to mobile internet use. Just to note here on the top right corner for Jordan, because mobile ownership is so high, this actually only represents 31 people, so the sample size here is fairly small, but across the rest of this data set, the sample size is a lot higher. So as you can see across both phone ownership and internet use, affordability comes out as a top barrier in all 3 contexts, and that's perhaps unsurprising, but it's important that other barriers also came out quite strongly, and we really need to create solutions that are multifaceted rather than just trying to tackle the affordability barrier, because it's certainly not the only one. We found that in the quant, but also in the focus group discussions. So for mobile phone ownership, for example, charging comes out as a key barrier in Kaziba and Bidi-Bidi, limiting people's ability to own a phone. And some of the recommendations that Matthew will talk you through are around things like innovative energy solutions with things like pay-as-you-go solar home systems, for example. For mobile internet, for more advanced use cases like mobile internet, digital literacy actually becomes more of a barrier. So you can see on the bottom row, many people were saying they don't know how to access the internet, they have nobody to teach them. And again, Matthew will go through how this feeds into our recommendations around digital literacy. So as I mentioned, we have 5 thematic areas, and the first one this report focuses on is gender and inclusivity. Our program as a whole focuses on this topic, looking at trying to increase digital inclusion for vulnerable segments of crisis-affected populations, including women and persons with disabilities. We have, under the foundation, a program called Connected Women, and their role is to accelerate digital and financial inclusion for women by reducing mobile gender gaps. They've actually managed to quantify the mobile gender gap by using the method shown at the bottom of this slide, where the mobile gender gap is a percentage that reflects how much less likely a woman is to own or use a mobile phone or certain features of one. In their latest gender gap report that they publish every year, they found that across low and middle income countries, on average, women are 10% less likely to own a phone than men. And for mobile internet, that figure's 23%. They quantify this number every year so that they can then try and address and close the gender gap. So they work with commitment partners who are mobile network operators to try and do this. As John was saying earlier, anecdotally, we heard a lot of information, but we didn't have the data. So we wanted to use this methodology in humanitarian, specifically refugee contexts, to try and quantify that gap for the first time. And this is what we found. So this slide shows the mobile gender gap across usage, ownership, and mobile internet. In terms of usage, this was looking at people who had used a phone within the last 3 months. We found that women in Bidi-Bidi are 23% less likely to have used a phone in the last 3 months compared to men. And in Kaziba, this figure was 5%. The gap then grows for ownership, with the gaps being at 47% in Bidi and 13% in Kaziba. And then it widens again for more diverse use cases like mobile internet. So in Bidi, this gap was huge at 89%. And this really reflects the fact that it's not a solution just to give people free handsets, because digital literacy training is really vital, as well as making use cases actually valuable to people to increase meaningful digital inclusion. This slide represents the fact that the mobile gender gap was most stark in Bidi, as previously mentioned, and highlights quite an interesting figure on the top right that suggests that if we're just looking at ownership, if the mobile ownership gender gap were closed, there would be 15,500 more women owning a mobile in Bidi refugee settlement alone. So this, of course, is not only a missed opportunity for refugees themselves, but also having figures like this helps us to work with mobile network operators for them to understand the opportunity of serving new customers if they could work together with humanitarian organizations to create tailored products and services, for example, and try and tackle some of the barriers to phone ownership. Within the qualitative research, we also really wanted to understand, we didn't want to just assume that mobile technology is helpful for refugees. We wanted to explore this in the focus group discussions. And for women, this really came out strongly. So we categorized some of the benefits into 4 different areas. The first one was safety and security, and women said that they equated phones with the ability to call for help in an emergency and spoke about how they felt safer with them. The second one was focused on communication with loved ones, especially in Kaziba, for example, which is a camp that is separate from the rest of the world. Women talked about the importance of phones to keep in touch with family and friends who might be in other areas of the world. And in terms of news and information, refugees often said that they felt disconnected from the world around them, and mobile gave them a way to, the ability to actually facilitate access to news. And then finally, livelihoods. Although this wasn't particularly common in Bidi or Kaziba, the research team did actually meet a number of women who were using their phones to run a wide array of businesses, ranging from things like being mobile agents to tailoring to even mushroom farms. So there's definitely a huge opportunity here. And again, Matthew will speak to some of the recommendations a little bit later on. Under this gender and inclusivity thematic area, I also mentioned that we focus on persons with disabilities, and at GSMA we have our newest program, which is called Assistive Tech, and it works to try and make technology more inclusive for people with disabilities. So we, for the first time, used the Washington Group short set of questions that looks at 6 different categories and identifies individuals with a condition or problem that puts them at risk of missing out or being excluded from humanitarian aid that they're entitled to. So we asked these questions, but just to bear in mind, this one on the right-hand side is around communication, and because of the nature of the survey, it was very difficult not to exclude people who had challenges communicating, so we probably exclude that component of people within this research. So what we found in terms of the mobile disability gap, we found actually that the prevalence of disability is greatest among refugees in Jordan, with 1 in 4 people having a disability established using the Washington Group short set of questions. This number was lower for refugees in Kaziba at 17% and in Bidi at 15%. When it comes to the mobile disability gap, we actually found that there were some use cases for which refugees with disabilities experienced a seemingly entrenched disenfranchisement, and the mobile disability gap for ownership is greater for people in Kaziba and Bidi when compared to Jordan. And this quote here at the bottom of the slide actually shows that in some of the focus group discussions, people with disabilities were actually asking directly for their skills to be built to be able to use mobile phones better through trainings. The second thematic area that we focused on for this research was mobile financial services, and probably of interest for a number of people on this webinar. This topic focuses on a range of uses of how mobile phones can be used to access financial services and make transactions. And we found in this research that mobile money was the most commonly used financial service by refugees and host communities in both Bidi Bidi and in Kaziba. So this slide shows that mobile money use, especially in Bidi Bidi and Kaziba, is fairly high, as I presented a little bit earlier on. In Bidi Bidi, 44% of refugees use mobile money, and Kaziba it's 59%. And then for host communities, not shown on this slide, the figures are also fairly high, 56% in Uganda and 36% for Rwanda. Interestingly, mobile money use is actually higher among the refugee population in Kaziba than the host community. And potential reasons for this, we heard through the focus group discussions that there was a high value proposition for using mobile money, for example, for sending money to children studying outside of Kaziba camp and also paying for school fees. However, we did find that mobile money is not equal across different segments of the population. So women and refugees with disabilities are significantly less likely to use mobile money in Bidi Bidi and Kaziba. We also found that older people use mobile money significantly less than younger people. And then the circle on the right represents Jordan. This may surprise some people, it may not, but we found that mobile money use among refugees is low at 1%. This is really reflective of the nature of mobile money. In Jordan, it's not very mature. Around 1% of the Jordanian population actually use mobile money as well, because the banking infrastructure is very mature in the country. However, we are seeing a move from humanitarian organizations to leverage mobile money to deliver cash aid to refugees in the country. So I think we'll see this increase in future years. So this is my last slide before I hand over to Matthew, and really outline some of the barriers that we found that came through the focus group discussions when people were talking about barriers to using mobile money. There were some crossovers in terms of barriers. For example, one of the major things we find that Matthew will speak to is the fact that many forcibly displaced people actually lack the identity documentation that is needed to legally be able to open a mobile money account. And many people in the focus group discussed this. We also found in Bidi Bidi that several different barriers emerged, from things like government-imposed mobile money taxes to lack of trust, liquidity, and connectivity challenges. And these are broken down a lot more in the report. And then also in this mobile money section of the report, we provide recommendations for our key stakeholders for how to address some of these barriers. So for now, I'm going to hand over to Matthew Downer, our Insights Manager in our M4H program, who's going to take you through mobile-enabled utilities and findings from digital identity.
Thanks, Jenny. If you bear with me 2 seconds, I'm just going to bring up the slides. Great. So like Jenny said, I'm going to start by taking us through the mobile-enabled utilities section of our report. It should come as a surprise to no one that access to energy is a key component in maximising the use of mobile technology. Without charging, our phones are useless. So as part of the survey, we wanted to look at people's access. So in all 3 settings, we asked people whether or not they had they had access to energy in their own home. In Jordan, it's 100%. This is unsurprising. We were talking to urban refugees who were living on the grid, so they were connected to the main energy source of Jordan. However, for those based in the settlement, in Kaziba and Bidi Bidi, the access was lower. So it was about 1 in 2 refugees in Bidi Bidi said they had energy in the home, and about 1 in 3 in Kaziba. And then you see how this translates quite quickly into the chart on the right, where we've shown all refugees who didn't have a phone. We asked them whether access to charging was a barrier for that. And you can see in Jordan, 1%, whereas for Kaziba and Bidi Bidi, we're looking at 50 and 61%. So where there's less access to energy, the charging becomes a problem. I think the mismatch between the 54% and the 61%, where there's obviously some overlap between energy and charging being a barrier, is that during the focus groups, we found out that for a number of refugees in Bidi Bidi, the energy they had was a solar lamp, which at one point was able to charge a phone, but over time, the potency of these lamps has decreased, and so their ability to charge has dropped. So for those that had energy, we asked them what the energy supply was, and as I mentioned, you can see that the solar lamp is the most popular in both Kaziba and Bidi Bidi. With the lamps, we know that quite a portion of these, especially in Bidi Bidi, were part of a distribution effort, but there are still cases where they're being purchased. But more interestingly, looking at solar home systems, where around 1 in 4 refugees in both settings had solar home systems. These have not been distributed. So what we're seeing is an organic reach from the commercial supply chain, which is leading to solar homes getting into the settlements. And this is something that we are quite interested in at GSMA. And if the other people are interested, we have got a report online looking at this market in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. I guess to focus on the 99% in Jordan for 1 second, like we discussed, the refugees that we were engaged with were all urban and on-grid. So it's quite unsurprising that nearly all of them said they were on-grid. So moving into the second thematic area that I'm going to cover today, which is looking at digital identity. Again, identity is key when accessing services. In most markets around the world, you need to have an official identity document in order to know your customer requirements and to get access to a SIM card. So we asked all refugees in all contexts that had a SIM card, whether it was registered in their own name. Interestingly, across all three, pretty much the same number came up. I can assure everyone we checked this number multiple times, but it's not very often you get the exact same figure for all of the groups. But what we saw is around 2 in 3 refugees having their SIM card registered in their own name. Which means that we've got 1/3 who are using SIM cards registered in the names of friends, family, service providers, any get around possible, because just because you don't have an identity document, it doesn't mean you're still not going to do whatever you can to get connected. And so there's here, and we will come to some discussions later perhaps, but there's a drive to help there's a drive to look at what might reduce those barriers to access and what IDs might be accepted to help refugees register their SIM cards. You see it on the right, some quotes looking around the get around. So I think the shorter one at the bottom, we have to borrow someone else's ID. So the SIM and mobile money is not registered in my name. That's a big challenge. And this is something to think through, because when your SIM is registered in someone else's name, it does mean that your mobile money account is also. Secondly, I'm not going to read the long quote out in full. You are welcome to, but I will summarize. In lots of the conversations we had, especially with community leaders, privacy online was a real concern. I think for community leaders, it came through because these individuals had been quite active in political opposition in their home countries. And so the concerns were that if they used the internet too much, people might discover where they are. And it might become in danger. I think this is something that anyone looking to digitize services needs to think through to make sure that your services and the metadata they create are not inadvertently causing protection issues for the populations that you're serving. And finally, in this section, whilst not strictly digital identity in the technical term, our research did discover some interesting behaviors around how people link their identity to their phone. And one that we wanted to highlight today is how quite a large proportion of people in all of the contexts were storing personal information about themselves on their phone. And this was varying from passwords for things, or pictures of their IDs that they can show people. They didn't have to carry it around. I think some of this is quite interesting if you think, for example, the attestation document is 1 document per household. And so other members of the household who didn't have that were taking pictures of it so they could have it to hand when they needed it. Like I said, this isn't digital identity in the way we describe it, but it does show that there is appetite there for products that link identity to mobile phones. So finally, I'm just going to run you through a handful of the considerations from the report. We don't go through all of them, but we've kind of cut them into 3 general settings, and I'm hoping that they will be a probe for discussion. So first of all, we wanted our recommendations thought about affordability. We saw at the start of the presentation that the cost of various elements of connectivity come through as highly prohibitive for all groups. And so we broke this down into 3 sets. For MNOs, we said where possible, is making handsets and services more affordable for low-income groups, such as refugees. And it might mean tailoring products to bring the prices down. For For humanitarians, it's looking at how can we support improved livelihood opportunities where possible to improve the economic means of these communities so they can access connectivity and they don't have to make tough decisions between purchasing food and purchasing airtime. And finally, for policymakers, where possible, it's to lower the cost barriers to enable this reduced price for MNOs. And that can be looking at overarching tax regimes or the wider regulatory environment, which might enable MNOs to reduce their costs. Secondly, in terms of usability, for here we're looking at literacy and digital skills. We see this as a two-pronged approach. So first of all, there is agency-led education to help people improve their literacy and their digital literacy. And this can be formal or informal trainings through agent networks or through staff of humanitarians. But secondly, to drive demand-side-led upskilling, it's important to create services that genuinely meet the needs and to fix barriers for the communities that are being served. If we create products that genuinely overcome challenges in people's lives, there will be a demand for them to teach themselves or learn from their friends to develop services. And I think in the case of something like M-Pesa in Kenya, which it has this example, you'll see that this can be a highly successful approach. And finally, there's the conversation around availability. And so for here, it's ensuring that there is a reliable supply of high quality and reasonably priced devices. And thinking through what actions you do might have a negative impact on the supply chains of the commercial model. So thinking if you make a distribution of handsets, you're probably going to stifle a natural market, which means there will not be a market for replacement handsets as and when the ones collapse. Improve options for mobile phone charging. This is a big element that we're interested in, but moving away from just having charging stations and looking at what other innovative ways you can to approach the charging question. And finally, to improve mobile coverage in the settings where there is weak coverage. And this is not just a task to the MNOs, it's also a task to the wider sector to create commercial incentives for them to play. So if we think back to where Jenny discussed, if we close the ownership gap for women, there would be an extra 16,000 customers in that area. Looking at elements like that will improve the business case for MNOs to extend their infrastructure. So I'm going to pass back to John from ENHR, looking at what our next steps will be.
So I'm sure as audience members, you may have been thinking about not only further questions about the research, but also some potential next steps. We have too. Obviously, as Jenny and Matthew outlined, there's such a rich data set here. The obvious next step is, while this is obviously a top line overview of some of the key statistics that we could still get a lot from this report, there's some deeper insights that we're looking at. We've got some of our data scientists who are crunching through this data at the moment. We're hoping to really dig into some of these reasons. One example might be those without a phone, for instance, in Kiziba, which stands at approximately 25% of men, 26% of women. So not so much of a gender gap. We're kind of keen in understanding why is that, and what are the other variables that are associated with these data, bits of data that we can sort of maybe point to some rationale for why that might be the case, and what those barriers are, and trying to eliminate them. Of course, this type of data, as I mentioned, moving away from the anecdotal to having this, helps us improve the way that we build out our strategy. So, there's a lot of really interesting findings, focusing also on these marginalized groups who are often left behind, I think is of increasing focus to us. And this data helps back this up. And I think the GSMA are finding the same, that our collective strategies are aligning, and not only us as two organizations, but the sort of sector around humanitarian technology is also aligning around these sort of ways of thinking based on the good evidence and data that we have. This data also helps with advocacy work, so coming with these statistics to help move and shift things, but also is a really good platform for debate and discussion. We were actually launching this report in Uganda yesterday and had operators, the government in the room, discussing these types of issues. And it was, the perfect platform for all of the different stakeholders around this to coalesce, develop sort of an approach together and partner and work together to try and overcome some of these barriers, which are clearly articulated in the research. And then on a sort of operational level, of course, within the three contexts that we're looking at, we have these data sets. UNHCR, with our implementing partners and other actors who wish to partner with us, please get in touch if you're interested in tackling some of these issues, are looking to design sort of targeted projects to maybe overcome some of these barriers. This could be, for instance, around the issues around digital inclusion for persons with disabilities, where we might want to pilot certain projects alongside our friends in the GSMA, or whether that's trying to look at, for instance, device supply chains. I was in Kaziba last week, and we went and there was very few devices available on the market, practically none available in Kaziba itself. Why is this? Is there an issue with regards to that supply chain? How can we try and improve that as UNHCR? So rather than, as Matthew was saying, drop thousands of phones on the ecosystem there, how can we rather enhance that supply chain so we get a consistent amount of affordable devices coming into the community to make it more sustainable in the long term? So this is just a snapshot of some of the next steps that at least we in UNHCR and the GSMA are thinking about. There are other things that will emerge from this, the deeper we dig into the data and the more practical aspects that we are able to sort of fathom from it. But this is obviously a good start. And then,
yeah, I think we're keen to hear people's questions.
Great. Thank you very much for that lovely presentation, Matthew, Jenny, and John. I think there's some questions that have come in already from our alumni, but just for me, one of the things that I find really fascinating is the difference between the different countries, what's going on, what are some of the challenges, what some of the barriers are, whether you're comparing what's happening in Jordan to what's happening in Uganda. And it's a good reminder that refugee doesn't mean a particular person. It's type of person, doesn't have the same problems and challenges, and they're different for different gender issues or disability issues. So that was a real interesting reminder from my side anyway. We've got a lovely question here from Beryl, who would like to know, can you give us some examples of the interesting use cases that refugees had for their mobile phones? So I think you mentioned school fees being one, paying those, but have you got any others that you could share with us?
Sure. Yeah, so obviously I'd encourage you to read the report if you have a chance. We try and make it kind of as navigable and interesting as possible by pulling out several examples of exactly how people are using their phone in kind of innovative or interesting ways. We call these a digital day in the life, and we have, I think, 5 or 6 throughout the report spotlighting some of these ways. So yeah, paying for school fees was certainly one interesting way. We heard of a few examples of people paying for their energy using pay-as-you-go solar home systems. This hasn't quite taken off so much in either Bidi Bidi or Kaziba, but there were some examples of people who had mobile money accounts whereby they received remittances from relatives abroad who would send them money that they could then use to pay for their energy consumption through pay-as-you-go solar home systems. We had other examples of people conducting their businesses mainly by using mobile money accounts or being mobile agents. And we heard in Uganda a number of people, well, the majority of the population there actually in Bidi Bidi are farmers, and they were looking up creative ways to be able to be more productive in terms of food, the growth of their crops, by looking up on the mobile internet how to protect their crops from various diseases and other things. So that's a few of the things I can think off the top of my head. I don't know if Matthew or John have anything to add.
Thanks, Jenny. I mean, just from my experience, I think almost I wouldn't do it. I think the innovation and creativity from a lot of the people that we're supporting almost, I think, goes beyond mine and everyone else's. The fact is that often we see rather ingenious approaches to the way people are using mobile devices, whether that's establishing social network groups for them to provide share information amongst the community members, whether that's pushing UNHCR to enhance the way it's providing access for individuals to get information on resettlement data or other humanitarian services that we're providing, or simply to engage with wider things happening on the internet. We've seen people using phones and hotspots to connect a radio station up to broadcast to other communities outside of refugee camps before. It really is, there are almost no limits to what we've seen people do with their mobile devices when they are, digitally included and have that ability to use them in these creative ways. And we do see it as a strong vehicle for, empowerment, really, across the board.
Yeah, some very interesting use cases there. Thank you very much. I'm going to also take a question that's come in from Maha about the charging. So can you give us some examples of what you mean by improving options for mobile charging? Are the charging stations currently not enough, or they don't work for charging?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So like I said, innovative charging is something that I think the whole sector is looking at right now, and it's still nascent in terms of we haven't totally proven the business models, but there are a couple of interesting models that I think are worth flagging. So one is linked to the solar home systems that I discussed earlier. They are coming through organically, but we're looking at ways that we can innovatively finance these so that they become available not just to the most economically empowered members of these communities. Specifically, how can we innovatively finance or perhaps subsidize slightly for disadvantaged groups in a way that can empower them? And I think what's interesting here is that these can also become livelihood streams for these individuals, because where people might be queuing up at the communal charging station, they might pay their neighbor the same price to use their solar home system, or they might just be able to use for free if they have good relationships. I think these are quite good models to look at. But other models we're looking at, which are quite interesting, are community-led. So kind of like charging hub stations. So if you've got a center that's providing a number of services, whilst you're using a service, being able to access the energy to charge your phone, or there are a number of these kind of community models which we're looking at. And I think that there will be a lot of interesting action in this space as we go forward over the next few years.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. I think, one thing that I've seen as well, and I think that community approach is really important. And I think what we'll end up seeing is that some of the providers of, for instance, solar home systems will almost, from some of the experience that I've seen, it's sometimes been, products are developed, then they're sort of offered to communities who don't always buy into them, but actually by, combining those two models to have that sort of communal model where you're utilizing a sort of pay-as-you-go system, aggregating demand, but also doing that in a really bottom-up way with communities, we'll end up finding a model that works. Because at the moment, some of the tests that we've tried to do, the amount of disposable income for refugees is very, very low, which has made this difficult. There are also a number of people within communities who actually their livelihood is related to charging. Maybe they're running a salon and offering charging business on the side. We need to be careful not to disrupt the market, but rather leverage it to increase availability and affordability of charging and increasing overall energy supply to the locations. And I think that UNHCR is going to be focusing a bit on the more macro side of how energy supply is working in these different locations to make that a bit easier and reduce the sort of extended costs.
Great, thank you. And like every solution is going to be varied to the context it's in. And I'm guessing also maybe several of those ideas in communities, because depending on the size and what's happening on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So we've got some gender gap related questions coming up here. So we've got one from Augustine, who is asking a bit more for the reasons of the difference percentages between women and men using mobile phones. And also a similar question coming in from Happy, who is asking, obviously cost is probably something that's involved, was literacy one of the other big contribution factors for women in particular? So maybe you can answer both of those questions together.
Sure.
Yeah. If I can jump in very quickly on that one, we actually published a paper in March specifically looking at this topic. So it's called Bridging the Mobile Gender Gap for Refugees. And if people are interested, I would recommend reading it, because my following 30-second explanation from total justice. But there were 4 barriers that we pulled out specifically affecting women. And these were by no means unique to women. They were just felt more acutely. And yes, cost is one of them, because we found that in most cases, women had less economic power than men, and so less disposable income. And yes, there were elements around literacy and digital literacy where, according to the survey especially, women were less likely to have basic literacy and less likely to have basic digital skills. But I think one thing which is important to bear in mind is in a lot of these cases, the social structures and the cultural dynamics do play a role. So we found in focus groups, for example, the women were saying they would only borrow from other women because the optics of borrowing from a man might cause them difficulty in the household. And therefore, if there was no woman they were able to borrow from, they would go without. So I think there's a piece around acknowledging, what those cultural dynamics are, and if there are ways that humanitarians can work with communities to diffuse some of those to make the culture more enabling for women.
Jenny, did you have something else to contribute?
No, I think Matthew said that very well, but also maybe just to flag again that we do have a Connected Women program that has a fairly large team focusing on this topic of closing the mobile gender gap across low and middle income countries with a number of different mobile network operators, and they all have some very unique and innovative ways to try and close that gender gap. So you can find some more resources online if that's something you're interested in understanding more about the barriers and the reasons why there is a gender gap, but also trying to look at some of the solutions to closing and addressing that gap.
Great, thanks, Jenny. And touching on that, so part of the response from Matthew was around digital literacy, and we had a question come in from Maha around that. So any recommendations on digital, if I can even say the words myself, digital literacy, and whether you've got any examples of good digital literacy trainings or technology that can help us with this?
Sure, thank you, Maha. So another program that we have at the GSMA is called Connected Society, and they are working to expand and extend mobile coverage to rural and remote locations and ensure that everyone is connected. One of the things they focus on is around digital literacy, and they've been looking at this topic for a number of years. Some of these challenges are very similar to the challenges that we see in humanitarian contexts. And they developed a number of years ago something called the MIST tool, which is, I think it stands for Mobile Internet and Skills Toolkit, which is really about leveraging agents to educate customers on how to use the mobile internet. They've seen some really interesting and impressive results here around kind of return on investment for mobile operators, but also for customers really having a much better understanding of digital literacy in the mobile internet and adopting it a lot more. We are now adapting this MIST tool in humanitarian contexts because we want to scale it back a bit. It needs to be a bit more basic for some of the populations that we're working with in humanitarian contexts who don't necessarily have ownership of a phone yet, let alone are trying to figure out or how to get online. So we're working in northern Uganda again with a few partners on this to try and drive digital inclusion through digital programs, and we're also working very closely with UNHCR on this topic, as well as UNCDF, who are doing a lot in Rwanda on this topic at the moment. But I think the key is ensuring that there is a continuous kind of supply of training rather than just a one-off training, which we've seen through time is not always the best solution.
Thanks, Jenny. Just a couple of comments from my side on this question. I think it's something that we've been looking at a lot as UNHCR, and as Jenny mentioned, we have a couple of sort of ongoing projects there. One thing that we have noticed, with a couple of pilots that we've done, is that technology diffusion and use of technology happens in society sort of regardless. You know, you have some early adopters and people who are then slower to adopt, and then it's sort of a tail at the end. And one of the things that we wanted to do was, rather than necessarily and we found this to be quite effective, rather than bringing in, let's say, an organisation agency to do digital literacy trainings, is to actually work with those early adopters within communities, those who are the first ones to start adopting technology, and support them in trying to help the diffusion of this within the society. So in Mauritania, we were supporting a group of women and girls who had started to use technology, but acknowledged that many of the women and girls around them had not yet done that. So rather than come in with a sort of training program, it was, well, how can we empower these women that are already sort of telling their friends how to use these devices, and provide them the tools and skills to be able to take that further out into the community. So I would just say that whatever solutions we're looking at, if you have a strong community involvement, it will help the outreach and the sort of scale of this beyond any sort of set training program. Obviously, tools like MIST are really, really important in helping provide the right sort of guidance and helping these women take that further. But that community involvement is key.
Great, thank you very much, both of you, for your answers on that one. And for anybody interested as well, our next DFI webinar looks at the topic actually of digital literacy. It's on the 30th of July, so if you're interested, please do sign up on the DFI webinar pages. Okay, moving on, we've got a couple of questions really around empowering women. So, are there any initiatives or examples of how we can empower women to use and access mobile phones? Both this from Grace and Happy. Have we still got you on the line, Jenny or Matthew?
Oh, sorry, we were having. Oh, you go, Jenny.
Sure, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, as I mentioned, the report doesn't really uncover any specific initiatives. What it does do is kind of showcase how some of the ways in which mobile phones are being used organically by women are benefiting their lives, but they're not kind of imposed interventions as such. As I mentioned, our Connect to Women team are doing a lot with mobile network operators, at least in development contexts, to work with mobile operators and also development partners to try and encourage and accelerate uptake and use of mobile for women. We, as part of our M4H program, have a market engagement function where we work on the ground with our different stakeholders on a number of different projects, and we also have an innovation fund offering funding of up to £500,000 to humanitarian organisations or private sector actors who are partnering together to develop interventions to accelerate digital humanitarian assistance. Some of those projects have been focusing on gender and inclusivity, especially in this second round, which is actually yet to be announced, so I can't speak much further, but in the coming weeks you will see some projects that we're working on that are focusing primarily on gender and inclusivity. So watch this space. But yeah, I'm not sure if, so this research, as I said, doesn't really uncover specific interventions, but we're certainly, it's something, a topic we're working on more broadly across the programme.
And Jenny, please do share that with us or with me and with our community online, so that we can hear about them. They sound really interesting.
Sure, will do.
And something here, we've got two questions really around the topic of affordability. So one from Augustine and one from Inongi. And it's really about, how can we control maybe prices of mobile phones, or even the cost of data, airtime, etc. Will MNOs reduce the cost of cell phones? Is there a way that maybe the government or regulatory bodies need to step in to help? Any thoughts on those?
Sure.
Go ahead, Jenny.
Okay, I was just going to say, yeah, it's a really interesting question and something we've been working on for a number of years, actually, before even our Mobile for Humanitarian program. We were focusing a lot more on natural disasters and seeing many instances of numerous humanitarian organizations knocking at mobile network operators' doors when something happens, saying, please give us free phones, free SIM cards. And as much as mobile network operators want to help and often do and can, sometimes in more, I guess, protracted situations where there are very remote communities and potentially kind of low profitability of these communities, it's a bit more challenging in terms of return on investment, because there doesn't always have to be a business case, because it can be a CSR initiative, but mobile network operators' money is not unlimited. And therefore, one of our recommendations in this research is really to work together, both the humanitarian sector and mobile network operators, to understand more about the situation on the ground. So it would be really beneficial, and I think there's lots of initiatives now happening whereby humanitarian organizations are aggregating the demand needed in terms of mobile connectivity and presenting that to mobile network operators in a coordinated fashion, which then really helps mobile network operators understand the opportunity and understand what the business model and business case could be, which then helps them to provide more services, or expanding infrastructure in the first place, improving infrastructure, or providing reduced costs of handsets and mobile services. It's something that I think is definitely improving across the sector, but ultimately, until there's kind of this shared value proposition among humanitarian organizations and mobile network operators, it is very difficult for MNOs to kind of provide those services for free, because it's just not sustainable in the long term. But yeah, John, maybe you have more to say on that.
Hi, yes, sorry, mute issue. Yeah, thank you, Jenny. I think this is something that we come across time and time again, particularly where there are issues around the ability to, the right to work for refugees, which is something that UNHCR is continually advocating for in the context where refugees are being hosted. And, with that, the ability to have a livelihood that provides a greater amount of disposable income. Research from the sort of GSMA's Connected Society team actually highlight how large a proportion of an individual's month income is that's spent on telecoms in some of the contexts that we're talking about here. And for refugees, that's even a larger proportion, what might be expected. Now, obviously, understanding that these populations are vulnerable, this is precisely the reason why there is humanitarian support provided from aid and development actors to enhance this. But whereas UNHCR may have in the past sort of wanted to provide, one-off, support, there's frequent anecdotes about UNHCR providing solar lanterns or so on. Can we be more strategic with our investment that we're making to support these populations that create a more sustainable ecosystem over time? And I think that's where we want to work closely with mobile network operators to overcome some of these gaps, whether that's looking at what the capital expenditure might be on a new cell tower in a location that would stimulate demand. Can maybe UNHCR help support, subsidize that? There's been projects that we've worked on with UNCDF in Uganda that have done precisely this, trying to mitigate the risk of investment for private sector actors. In terms of device handsets, how can we sort of aggregate demand? We've got basic phones now coming in at under $5 and smartphones working their way down towards under $20 a device. This trend is going to continue, but understanding those are still large sums for the populations we're working with. Can we try and mitigate that upfront payment, by maybe sort of looking at microfinance to try and make this more affordable? I don't think we're looking at, free phones, because this isn't sustainable, but we are trying to sort of enhance those supply chains, make it more competitive environment and reduce costs. And ultimately get people connected. And if there aren't commercial cases, there'll be alternative approaches that we look at as both UNHCR and the communities that we're working with to ensure this. And it also can't just be one isolated avenue. When you look at providing devices or supporting a device ecosystem, we also have to take into context, how is UNHCR providing all the other services? Can we gain efficiencies by then facilitating a hotline rather than having in-person, help desks, which obviously take up a lot of human resources? So there are things we're trying to do, with mobile, with our cash operations, with other parts of UNHCR's delivery that aim to sort of bring this in as a transformative component that actually enables us to enhance the way that we're doing things and ultimately reduce costs as well.
Thank you, John and Jenny, for that answer. And also we had just a comment that came in from Delia, who wanted to thank you for mentioning the need to identify the shared value between humanitarian and private sector to address the cost and distribution. But it's not one person's alone problem or one person's issue to solve, but it's a partnership that needs to be developed between all the players, really. And we have one final question, which connects back through to you brought up rights of refugees and vulnerability. And Fonton has an interesting question about complaints management and recourses for refugees when services are not working. How might that need to be different in this refugee context?
I think, one of the things that UNHCR does as a matter of course is provide protection services for all individuals within its care in a particular location. Now, these can differ depending on the context, but often if there's sort of, something related, I think this question was sort of looking at relating to the work of a mobile network operator, then we have sort of an engagement there as well to be able to build this out. UNHCR often in different contexts we operate in, call center, for instance, in Jordan, the context mentioned, we have face-to-face protection counseling. There are access to information and so on through online portals. There's quite a number of avenues in which individuals can get in touch with UNHCR, but also it depends on the nature of what the complaint is about. So UNHCR isn't responsible for all aspects of delivery. And like I was mentioning, if this is, for instance, relating to how their mobile phone is functioning, of course, they can come to UNHCR and refer that onto mobile operators, but mobile operators will also have their own agents who can provide support network in terms of how to use devices and so on. And then obviously within the humanitarian community, there are a number of different issues where this may be dealt by one NGO or anyone else. And often we have sort of systems in place to help refer people to the right location. But I think it's something we acknowledge we want to enhance and do better. We want to ensure that this is inclusive. So not only providing one channel, but multiple different channels, whether people have mobility issues. So that would be a sort of phone would be easier than going in person. But likewise, if phone isn't possible because, somebody's deaf, that we have alternative ways of doing that to ensure that it's as inclusive as possible. So trying to continuously improve our approach here.
And I guess one small addition from me as well is that making sure that our MNO members have got agent networks that are well trained. And that's the piece of work that we are working in partnership with our members to look at where they have extensive agent networks operating in the communities with refugees as their customers, that they are trained not just in customer service, but also in the humanitarian code of conduct and in understanding the unique vulnerabilities that might be presented in this market, in these communities. And I think when you make sure that both sides of the coin, the private sector and the humanitarians, are working together, you can build out quite a good both protection and customer service experience for these communities.
Yeah, and just one small addition from me. I agree with everything that's been said, but some of the most successful examples that we've seen, or for example, when there are these cash aid programs that are leveraging mobile money, when the trainings are undertaken with mobile network operators alongside humanitarian organizations, that's really the key to making this work, because both sectors have very unique core competencies, and when they're brought together, then that's where you get most added value for customers or beneficiaries who will ultimately, hopefully, benefit from these mobile services.
Great, Jenny, and that kind of connects to one of my very last points. Anyway, I'm just going to share my screen with you, because what DFI are trying to do at the moment as well is to bring these sectors together. So one of the things that we'd like to do for anyone that is interested and has been on this webinar, DFI are offering a discount on both our mobile money operations course and our digital humanitarians payments course to try and get more people through, and also try and encourage more organizations to work together in this particular way. So I encourage people to take advantage of that opportunity. And also just to remind everybody DFI does have a group on LinkedIn called the League of DFS Professionals. If you're not part of that, please do join us. We do regularly talk about issues around mobile money, humanitarian, refugees, as well as all other topics on the DFS sphere. And if you're interested, as I said, in that financial education and literacy webinar, we've also got other webinars coming up in the future. So just a little plug there from DFI to end. But I would really love to thank our three speakers for the day, Jenny and Matthew from GSMA and John from UNHCR. It's been a really interesting conversation today. We're going to share, I will get from you some of the resources you mentioned and communities that you mentioned. We'll share them with participants afterwards as well, just to connect everybody together. But thank you so much for taking the time today to share with us your research and your thoughts and your knowledge on this and recommendations. And maybe we can have a similar webinar again with an update sometime in the future.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
And thank you all to the alumni who joined us today. It was great to see so many of you, and we hope to connect with you soon. Okay, thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.